Robyn is the author of Policing Black Lives, State Violence in Canada from Slavery to the Present. Her book is a CBC national bestseller and has been designated as one of the best 100 books of 2017 by The Hill Times. And in 2018, she was named Author of the Year by Montreal's Black History Month. And for over a decade, Robyn Maynard has been involved in community advocacy and activism against racial profiling, police violence, detention, and deportation. She also has extensive work history in harm reduction-based service provision, serving sex workers, drug users, incarcerated women, and marginalized youth right here in Montreal. So today, Robyn will be giving a presentation that explores the phenomenon in policing Black lives in Canada, along with the defunding and disarming movements that have gained significant momentum around the world recently, and especially right here in Canada and in Montreal. Thank you so much, Robyn, for being here today.
Thank you so much for having me. So I'm really glad to be here speaking with all of you about the realities of policing, about the history of policing, and also all of this serves to ground, of course, the movement that we're seeing across North America, this massive and unprecedented and exciting movement toward defunding the police. So I want to make sure that we do have time for questions today. And I'll also apologize in advance if my son makes a guest appearance saying hello to all of you today as well. But the three things that I'll be discussing is, first of all, a bit of a historical element. I think that if we understand how police evolved as a kind of racial violence, as a kind of gendered violence, it becomes easier for us to understand really what it means and the necessity, of course, of defunding the police. Then secondly, I'll be speaking about a more contemporary scope. What is policing? What do police actually do in the present moment? And all of this grounds the main focus, of course, of what we're really here to talk about today. What does defund the police mean in a Canadian context? What does it encompass? What does it not encompass? And where are we going with this freedom struggle that we are finding ourselves in this moment? Firstly, just to note that we're in such an incredibly exciting time. Really unprecedented protests across North America, seeing incredible wins in some ways in some cities in terms of just this Black-led and multiracial revolt against the status quo, against the killings of Black people by police, against anti-Black racism more broadly, and really bringing to light the crisis that is the policing of Black people's lives, and as well of Indigenous peoples, of everybody's lives, the crisis really that is policing in society today. So it's an incredibly powerful moment when we see, for example, that half of the Canadian population in this time is in support of this call to defund policing, something that was absolutely, to me, unimaginable a year ago or even 6 months ago. So I just want to ground that fact that we are really in a moment of unprecedented historical shifts of understanding of the meaning of policing, of the history of policing. So I'm very glad to share this moment with you today. So in order for us to truly understand the way in which policing has evolved as a kind of anti-Black violence, as a kind of anti-Indigenous violence, as a kind of gendered and economic violence, we need to look to the history of how policing has evolved. If we understand, of course, policing in the North American context as having evolved from slave patrols of enslaved people who'd run away in the American South. In the Canadian context, the surveillance of Black people's lives in public, the criminalization of Black people's lives in public was something that was part of the practice of slavery, which is something that was legal in the colonies that became Canada for over 200 years. If we look to the work of slavery scholar Charmaine Nelson, formerly based in Montreal, we understand that, of course, Black people were already assumed to be criminal in public space because of the popularity of what were called runaway slave ads that would describe Black people in great detail as being supposedly criminals guilty of the offense being having run away, having deemed that they were not property, having deemed that they were human beings, right? That there is a long history of Black people in public space already being seen as suspect, already being seen as possibly criminal throughout the evolution of slavery in Montreal and in the Atlantic provinces. If we look to the way that policing evolved, we can see that it was always already a continuation of controls over Black people's lives. If we look to the arrest rates, for example, we see that Black people were being disproportionately arrested and charged and incarcerated in many Canadian cities throughout the 19th century, throughout the early 20th century. Policing was something that was racial more broadly. We also see the massive overrepresentation of Irish men and women who, of course, were not deemed white at this time. So in many ways, it evolved as a kind of racialized control of particular populations that were not the most ideal white settlers in the Canadian context. The policing of Indigenous life is also something that really policing in this country evolved to partake in. If we look at the actual creation of the Northwest Mounted Police, which was, of course, the early iteration of the RCMP, then we can understand that it was already quelling Indigenous rebellion and used towards the clearing of Indigenous peoples from their territories in the prairie provinces. This is something that, of course, continues. If we look to the policing at Barrier Lake, at Wet'suwet'en, we see that the policing of Indigenous land struggles is something that has been ongoing, a direct line tying the past into the present. The RCMP also played important roles in quelling labor revolts and people that were working to change the unjust economic system that, of course, we still find ourselves in today, where we see the police again playing a role in the protection of private property, supporting the gentrification of neighborhoods across Canadian cities, across North American cities. A report was just released today in Ontario that shows that the policing of Black life remains something that is endemic to this country. If you look, it found something that, of course, as Black activists, as Black scholars working on, as Black community members, as Black family members, has been incredibly clear that Black people are being disproportionately stopped, that Black people are being disproportionately arrested, charged, harmed, and killed by the police across Ontario is, of course, something that we knew to be a reality. It had already come out in a preliminary report a few years ago that Black people were 20 times more likely to be shot by police than white people in Toronto, that this is a reality of what policing is. So I spoke a little bit about the history of the policing of Black people's lives as something that emerged, of course, from slavery in the service of settler colonialism and Indigenous genocide. This is something that, again, was given drastically more powers as police were given more powers in the 1980s and 90s as the war on drugs, as the criminalization of drugs took hold. And that was something that was, again, very much justified by the notion that Black people were inherently criminal, that Black people were always under suspicion of being were really the profile of being the drug trafficker, a Black woman as being the drug mule, which is something forwarded by Brian Mulrooney, and something that Canada actually worked with the United States. We often talk about Black activists and Black scholars are often told that we are emulating the United States, that we're trying to say that Canada is like the US falsely, but it's actually important to know that the kind of racial profiling of Black people that was given so much more police powers in the 1980s was actually because Canadian law enforcement were being trained in the US and by the DEA, by the Drug Enforcement Agency in the United States, the same kind of racial profiling practices that in both countries saw a massive boom in the policing and in the incarceration of Black people under drug related charges, even though we know, as we knew then, that Black people are not more likely to use or sell drugs, right? That this is directly about profiling. So that's an important part of the history that I think we really need to look at, that ties us from a certain historical kind of policing from the past into the present. The policing of gender is always something that has, again, been interrelated to how policing has evolved, how law enforcement has evolved in this country. The criminalization of what was called cross-dressing enabled the policing of gender, the policing of transgender women, the criminalization of transgender people more broadly in public space. The Indian Act in particular enabled the policing of Indigenous women's personal homes and private spaces under prostitution laws. Prostitution laws were also used to disproportionately arrest Black women in public space in the late 19th century and in the early 20th century, and still continues to be one of the reasons that the police give for Black women being stopped so disproportionately by police. And it's just important for us to mention this because Black women and Indigenous women so often fall out of the lens of what policing is, because we have, I think, a frame that tells us of the very brutal realities faced by young Black men being targeted by police. But it's very important for us to remember that this has always also been a gendered practice, that Black women are being disproportionately stopped and surveilled. If we look to the reality of Majisa Phillip in Montreal, who had her arm broken by the police, for example, and then she was subsequently charged for that. If we look to the realities of the policing of Indigenous women in Val d'Or, the study that came out recently with CBC that showed the endemic violence that Indigenous women were facing from police, again, in in Quebec, right? That this is that gendered violence has always been a part of what policing is, that policing is racial violence, that policing is gendered violence and economic violence. This is part of the historical evolution of what police were created to do. And I think that the reason that this history is so important is because it really helps us conceive of policing in a way that leads us towards defunding, that leads us towards abolition as opposed to reform. Because if we understand what police were designed to do, then we cannot let ourselves be fooled by the notion that the system is broken, that it needs to be fixed, right? If we understand that policing are doing what they were designed to do, when we look at the massive disproportionate stops of Black people's moving through public space, of driving while Black, of these arrests and charge as something that actually policing was historically created to do, then it becomes clearer to understand the need to actually move away from the system of policing itself. Today, my focus is going to be on law enforcement, but I'm going to highlight a few times that it's important that we see as interrelated the other forms of policing of Black communities that have evolved historically that are part of the present day. So we often talk about, this call to sometimes when people are speaking about defunding, there can be an uncritical call to replace police with social workers, for example. But it's important for us to understand that the legacy of social work has already been part of the surveillance of Black families, of Indigenous families, leading at many times to the removal of Black children from their homes and Indigenous children from their homes at rates that are so massive that it is important for us to understand that policing and surveillance is embedded into other institutions in our society as well. That it's, of course, law enforcement is really the focus of this talk today and of many of the movements that we're seeing, but it's related to, for example, you can't talk about defunding the police and ending policing as an institution without, of course, also connecting that to struggles to abolish prisons as a way of caging people who have, of course, broken the laws that are being policed in the first place, right? This is part of a broader movement that's asking us to reconceive of public safety and understanding that policing have nothing to do with public safety, particularly for Black community members, for Indigenous community members. So with that, I'll move briefly into what do police actually do in the present moment, because again, I think this helps us to really ground the struggle of moving away from policing as the supposed solution to violence, to social unrest, etc. So even though violent crime has been down since 1970, police budgets across, the amount of money allocated for policing across provinces federally as well has continued to increase massively, especially over the last 20 years. At this time, according to Statistics Canada recently, we see that up to 80% of police calls are related to issues of mental health, of drug overdose, of suicide, of domestic disputes and domestic violence. And that's something that's really crucial, because if we understand that each of these issues in particular, that policing is actually something that exacerbates each of these issues, then it becomes helpful to understand that the vast majority of what policing actually accomplishes is actually harmful and is not helpful. So if we look even to the policing of mental health crises, we know, of course, in Montreal, I think where many of you, I believe, are based today, of course, the police response to Pierre Coriolan, the Haitian Black man who was having a mental health crisis in his apartment, who ended up being shot with tasers with rubber bullets and finally real bullets as he was on his knees. In his apartment in Centre Sud. We know, of course, in Ottawa, the police killing of another Black man, Abdirahman Abdi, a Somali man in a mental health crisis who was beaten to death by an officer. We know there are countless cases, Andrew Loku as well, of course, in Toronto. The cases, particularly when it comes to Black communities, are egregious. If we understand that the police response to mental health crises is something that exacerbates the crisis and that can actually lead to violence and death, then of course we understand that the police are not trained to be mental health workers, that police are not trained to manage this kind of crisis, and that instead of pushing for police to have more trainings when in fact their role is as violence workers, that we really just need to understand this itself as an inappropriate response to mental health crises. Similarly, if we look at drug overdose, right? We know, for example, that drug users, organizations, and advocates have been calling to actually have the police not come on the ambulance calls for drug overdoses, because what that results in is people not wanting to call for an ambulance when they need help, which of course exacerbates the massive deaths due to what's called the overdose crisis, but really is related to the criminalization of drugs in our society. Black feminists have done incredible work to show so clearly, particularly since the 1990s and early 2000s, that police responding to domestic disputes, particularly for Black women, for racialized women, for migrant women, often means that the women who actually called or had the police called ended up being harmed themselves. This is research from the United States by Andrea Ritchie, by Beth Ritchie, and others, that even though the police would be called in a domestic dispute or a situation of domestic violence, that often the woman would experience arrests or charged from the police or even violence from the police. So again, we see that policing exacerbates this issue as opposed to being a solution. So I think it's really important for us to understand what actually takes place in terms of policing, because that helps us realize that although safety is important to all of us, that ending violence is important to all of us, that policing is not actually accomplishing that thing that we call public safety. Over the last 20 years, there's been a massive reinvestment in what are called SWAT teams, right? Which, as we know, is a tactical squad, often highly armed. That if we look, of course, to the death of Bonnie Jean-Pierre, a Haitian man who was killed I forget if it was Saint-Michel or Montréal-Nord, it was Montréal-Nord, excuse me, in the context of a drug bust by a SWAT team in Montreal over what ended up being very small amounts of marijuana. We understand again that SWAT teams, especially in relation to a substance that, white Montrealers are using on the mountain at the Tam Tams once a week, we again see that there's a kind of racial violence here that can't be abstracted from what SWAT teams do. If we look towards the policing of what's called youth violence, again, we can understand that police are something that is not bringing more security to our communities, but is actually bringing more insecurity. So for example, street gangs in Montreal in 2009 was considered 1.6% of crime, according to Le Devoir, that had studied this, but there had actually been massive budget increase over the last several years. And when asked about it by the newspaper, they had said because they needed to respond to the perception of street gangs. So again, this massive policing of Black neighborhoods, of neighborhoods where larger Black populations live, like Montréal-Nord, like Saint-Michel, like Jane and Finch in Toronto, is also very much related to just the idea that Black people in particular are criminal, that Black youth, particularly, in groups of 3 or more in public space, need to be policed, as opposed to actually responding to any perceived threat. In situations where they're actually, of course, we know that violence can be an issue in all communities. But again, increasing funding to policing has never been a solution to that, when the police are the ones that are disproportionately stopping and carding and arresting and sometimes beating and ending the lives of Black people. So even a government-funded study called the Roots of Youth Violence report, looking at the cause of gun violence in Black and racialized communities in Toronto, recommended not more funding for police, but funding for community centers for after-school programs for the kinds of things that communities actually need. I already spoke, I think, about the policing as a source of gendered violence as opposed to a response to gendered violence, and brought in the realities of the policing of Indigenous women in Val d'Or. Also, a report in Human Rights Watch uncovered massive, horrific treatment of Indigenous women in British Columbia. In prisons in the 1990s, a report showed that Black women were experiencing sexual harassment and assault, being forced to work difficult manual labor while they were pregnant. This again shows us that law enforcement and the carceral system more broadly is a kind of harm for our communities. I think it's important that we remember, even, sometimes the question when it comes to policing is, but what about the rapists? What about the rapists? How are we going to protect women? So it's important to remember that in our societies, again, the police are not preventing sexual assault in a context where in 2014, 83% of sexual assaults were not even reported to police, that a very small percentage of sexual assaults actually end up in a guilty verdict. It's very clear that policing does not prevent sexual assault and gendered violence. It's very rare that consequences occur. And in fact, police are in many cases the source of gendered violence. So what this asks of us is to rethink the notion that policing is about safety and I think really continues to demonstrate that policing is the opposite of safety, particularly for our communities, but for all communities. The policing of poverty is something that is, I think, one of the most harmful and most really visceral ways that we can see that we're choosing violence and we're choosing a very carceral response to issues that absolutely do require support, but we're choosing policing instead. So if we look to the massive poverty rates, particularly of Black and Indigenous communities who are vastly overrepresented in peoples that are living on or close to the streets, instead of actually managing the issue, of course, of gross economic inequality and homelessness, we're continuing to see the policing of bylaw infractions, the policing of sleeping in public benches and things like this, as opposed to, if you think about those over $100,000 a year salaries in a city like Toronto for police, as opposed to just investing in what it would mean to support people who do not have homes, we see that we're continuing to use policing as a solution to social inequalities, to economic inequalities, to racial inequalities, that is only making those issues worse. So another question is, why not reform? And again, I think that with some of this history, it becomes clear that, of course, in a system that was designed to surveil, to control, to hold captive Black and Indigenous peoples, that most reforms, especially small, that there are many reforms that are just going to do nothing but improve the legitimacy of the institution. And that's why these reforms tend to be so harmful. I'm sorry, just one moment. Excuse me. So from the perspective of protecting Black people's lives, we need to see that so many of the reforms that have been brought forward in policing in Canada, in the United States, have been an abject failure in terms of actually protecting Black communities, in terms of ending police violence. A CBC study actually showed that over the last 20 years, police killings have gone up massively, right? So we're continuing to see, in a time where reforms continue to be thrown at our communities as protests continue to decry the disproportionate killing of our community members, that reforms have just extended the longevity of policing in our society and have done nothing to actually end the crisis of violence at the hands of the police. So at the municipal level, some police forces have implemented what are called diversity or sensitivity trainings. In Montreal, after the killing of Anthony Griffin in 1987, many, very critical and wonderful Black activists were sort of drafted into training the police at that time to help them understand things like diversity, racial sensitivity, and these issues. And of course, we see throughout the 90s just an ongoing spate of killings of Black communities that leads us into the present day of Pierre Coriolan and of so many others. The recruitment of female and visible minority officers. Of course, in Toronto, we have a Black head of police in a time where we see Black people being killed by police at a rate that is 20 times higher to white peoples. So again, this idea of diversifying policing, when that goal and aims of policing is racialized control, is repression, that this tinkering or these reforms are not able to bring us justice. Similarly, the idea of community policing. I've seen this firsthand myself, even as a community outreach worker, which I was before moving to Toronto. The fact that there is one community outreach officer passing on information and, surveilling communities, while the rest of policing, again, remains a kind of violence, a kind of police stops, is something that is an ineffective reform that does nothing, again, to stop the harms against Black community members. At the provincial level, one reform that we've seen be an abject failure yet again has been the creation of civilian oversight mechanisms. So in Ontario, we saw the creation of the Special Investigations Unit, the SIU, after massive Black protests emerged in the late 1980s and 90s because of killings of Black community members. Of course, this ended up being staffed by largely ex-police officers, exonerating almost all officers that were charged, of which there were few. In Quebec, the creation of the Bureau d'enquête indépendante followed a very similar path, with so-called independent investigations staffed by significant number of ex-police, and again, doing nothing to stop the reality of police violence and of police impunity. So as police budgets have increased massively, police killings have also increased massively, even as these trainings and reforms have been sort of sold to our communities as ostensibly solutions. And finally, before I move on to just defunding broadly, I just want to remind us, of course, that what sparked off the wave of protests that we find ourselves in the present moment, of course, was the police, the execution, the public execution of George Floyd in a place where body cams had already been brought in and were being widely used, were actually being used in that situation, in a city where there had already been an Indigenous head of police, where there had already been a Black head of police, where diversity trainings had already been implemented. And yet we find ourselves again in the situation where many of us have seen what happened to George Floyd. So this is just to say, again, something that grounds the movement to not gear our efforts as those of us committed to racial justice, to justice more broadly, into these kinds of reforms that we now know to be ineffective, that we need to ground our justice struggles elsewhere. So that brings us to defunding. And what does police defunding really mean? And what I want to ground us in is the most broad understanding of what this means, which is recognizing that policing is a form of harm and working to reduce and diminish its scale, scope, and powers with the goal of building a police-free future. So let's see. I wanted to speak about a lot, but I also want to give time for questions. So I'm gonna call this, I was gonna give a little bit of a history of this movement, but I think that it's very clear, I hope, that of course, the global Black struggle to abolish slavery is one that that many Black people today and from the 1960s onwards really continuously have recognized as unfinished. That because of the realities of Black people still being subject to widespread surveillance, to captivity in the form of prisons, in the form of immigration detention, that Black people's freedom is not yet actualized. And the contemporary abolition movement, of course, emerged particularly from incarcerated prisoners who are really tying the links between policing and prisons today and forms of anti-Black practices that were part of the past. So I just want to give a little bit of that historical legacy. And now really it's been particularly, I would say, Black feminist intellectuals and scholars and activists that have done some of the incredible groundwork that has actually led us to the police defunding movement that seemed to come out of nowhere over the last 3 months, but is actually something that has been part of political practice in Black freedom-based movements, in groups like Movement for Black Lives, long before. Just to tie, the fact that this is happening now is because of a longer history of struggle to change consciousness and to change the institutions in our lives today. So police defunding is not only about money. And I say that to say that it's not just about austerity, about saving a municipal budget. Of course, that's something that is crucial, but it's important for us to remember it as part of a broader political struggle to actually keep people alive, to create safety in our society. So while it's very important, and I think for us to understand that, for example, the Toronto police budget is over $1 billion and that massively less, public tax money goes into things like funding community housing and shelters. That's something that's very clear, that's very crucial. If we look to how much money is spent on policing and prisons in our society versus conditions that would actually increase people's safety, it shows us the priorities of the society that we live in. So it's important for us to think about budgets. But I just want to point out that it's not only just about saving taxpayer dollars, for example, right? It's about, of course, redirecting money that is being used towards harmful repression into communities that require it. So I'm going to just read, I think, excuse me? Somebody speaking? Okay, I'll go on. I'm going to just quote a really excellent handbook that had been put together by Andrea Ritchie and Mariam Kaba, two excellent Black feminists based in the United States, from a defunding document that they had put together, because I think it just gives a perfect description of what defund police means. They say, defund police is a demand to cut funding and resources from police departments and other law enforcement and invest in things that actually make our communities safer, quality, affordable, and accessible housing and healthcare, increased community-based mental health services, income support to stay safe during the pandemic, safe living wage employment, education, and youth programming. It is rooted in a larger invest, divest framework articulated in the Movement for Black Lives vision for Black lives. It is a strategy that goes beyond dollars and cents is not just about decreasing police budgets, it's about reducing the power, scope, and size of police departments. It's about delegitimizing institutions of surveillance, policing, and punishment, and these strategies, no matter who is deploying them, to produce safety. It's a strategy to advance a long-term vision of abolition of police through divestment from policing as a practice, dismantling policing institutions, and building community-based responses to harm, need, and conflict that do not rely on surveillance, punishment, and policing. Now, I apologize if that's long, but I think it sums up so perfectly exactly what is the broader political investments of the defunding movement that really, again, is something that is absolutely rooted in safety and in ending violence, and identifies policing as something that actually increases violence in our society. So one part of, I'm going to talk a little bit about the strategies that we're seeing right now, because I think we're kind of seeing a really incredible, this massive push across Canada. I was hosting a Zoom recently where I got to speak with mostly Black, but not only Black activists from Vancouver to the Yukon to Edmonton. And we're seeing so many different kinds of strategies in terms of what it means to defund police across the country. Of course, in the United States, that's even more clear. So I just want to go over some of the different strategies that we're seeing at this current moment before taking some time to go over to questions. So one of the main parts of defunding is, of course, targeting budgets. That's something that's really crucial. The defunding police work in Montreal has been incredibly powerful in supporting, in demanding a drastic decrease in police budgets. The Black Lives Matter Toronto, for example, is pushing for an immediate 50% decrease in the policing budget, which again in this city is $1 billion. This kind of aim is to reduce police budgets by either specific dollar amounts or a percentage, and again, trying to commit to not increase police funding in the future. This is always, of course, related to investing those funds instead into community-based education, into long-term and supportive housing, into jobs for community members. So of course, it's never only about taking away, but it's about building up community safety in a way that does not involve, police with guns walking down our streets, stopping teenagers, right? So investing in things like public transit, community-based anti-violence work, this sort of thing. Another related issue of defunding, because again, budget is one part of it, but there's also reducing the scope, reducing the size, there's so much more. So with shrinking the actual size, in some of this is looking at enacting hiring freezes in some American cities. In a city like Montreal, that could be related to things like ending Eclipse, the Eclipse anti-gang squad, which again has been one particularly egregious form of surveillance of Black community members. Also cutting units, that work on things like quality of life or community policing, and to reallocate again these funds into community-based supports in neighborhoods where we know that the neighborhoods where, for example, gang-based units are policing are also the neighborhoods that very rarely have access to decent green space, to decent after-school programming, and things like this. Another main aspect of this move is to shrink the scope of policing. So that's been something that we've seen be incredibly powerful across Canada and the US right now. So for example, Black Lives Matter Toronto, getting Toronto police out of the Pride Parade is something that is one reduction of scope that is powerful. The move to get the police out of the TDSB, Canada's largest school board, again, is something that was an incredible move to shrink the scope of policing, that is to shrink the places that policing are embedded within in our society, to minimize the harm in the situation of schools of young people's, right? So we've seen that happen successfully in Hamilton. Black Lives Matter in Edmonton is working to remove what are called SROs from schools there. We see this push in Vancouver as well. And this is one of the major strands of what this defunding movement looks like right now. Shrinking equipment is, of course, part of this. So in Halifax, for example, there was going to be the purchase of a $500,000 police tank, and instead, due to popular outcry, and of course efforts of activists in the years before as well, sort of galvanizing, now we see that money again being reallocated into communities. Shrinking the laws and shrinking the power is something that I won't get into too much just because we're getting close on time, but it's really crucial because it's not only about, of course, the actual police force itself, but it's about what police are enabled to do. If we have bylaws that criminalize poverty, and by which I mean criminalizing people sleeping on a park bench, really things that criminalize homelessness, right? Urinating in public, as opposed to just, putting in public washrooms, supporting long-term housing, removing the power of laws that criminalize homelessness, that criminalize sex work, that criminalize drugs, for example, is one major way that we take away the power of that enables the policing of our communities in the first place. So I'm going to share very quickly in the chat something. I'm just running out of time, but I want to make sure that I have shared this, because this is a graph that is put together by an abolitionist organization in the United States, Critical Resistance, that looks at reformist reforms versus abolitionist reforms, that shows us which kinds of reforms can lead to actually more budget for policing, for example, even when they seem to ostensibly be about protecting communities. So it asks for, say, something like body cams that's being forwarded by Valerie Plante, that's being forwarded by John Tory, by Justin Trudeau. If we look at this graph, which I invite you to do now or later, of course, it asks us, does this increase the scope of policing? Does this increase the budget of policing? And the answer of both of those questions is yes. We also know that body cams have been shown in studies not to actually improve Black communities' safety. So you can see that there are some reforms that are marketed to us as about harming or ending police harms, but are actually things that increase police budgeting, increase reliance on police. So just to say that it's important, the kinds of demands and strategies that we're seeing of the defund movement are strategically chosen in order to reduce and not increase funding towards policing, power of policing, and scope of policing, right? I think that you'd wanted to end at 12:40. I just want to end, though, with a quick reminder that okay, I'll end on saying this. The most important element is that defunding police is about building the conditions for safety. In the words of Mariam Kaba in the New York Times, wrote this excellent piece where she says, "We are not abandoning our communities to violence. We don't just want to close police departments. We want to make them obsolete. We can build other ways of responding to harms in our societies." It's an important reminder that police defunding is concerned with ending violence, interpersonal, community-based, what's called gang violence, domestic violence, but doing so without resorting to more violence at the hands of police, in jail and prison cells. It's about creating the conditions of safety differently. It's about imagining a kind of safety that does not rely on armed officers in our communities. If we look to the ads or the alternatives forwarded by Black Lives Matter Toronto, I'll just read a few of them: create crisis intervention and MAD co-led support teams that work with communities to develop mental health responses that work for them. Create police-free, community-led, trauma-informed emergency service for mental health and psychiatric distress and other forms of crisis. Invest in community support for shelters, drop-ins, after-school programming in low-income and Black and Indigenous neighborhoods. These are just a few. Right? So I just want to really clarify the importance that this is a movement that is about building safety and not taking safety away. So, I mean, I guess I will just end with that really, in this incredibly important and historical moment, there are so many ways to plug into defunding, because policing is built into the fabric of so many parts of our society. There's a place in this movement for labor, for teachers, for artists, for activists, and that really in this time, choosing to be on the right side of history, choosing to build a freer world, to defund, to demilitarize, to disarm and dismantle the police, that we are really in the crux of a massive societal transformation. And I would urge everybody to read all that you can about the legacy of policing in this country, to really do the work to understand what is being forwarded with calls to defund policing more broadly. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Robyn, for your talk, for your presentation. So now we're going to enter into the question and answer period. We've been getting a lot of questions, and we're going to do our best to try and get through as most as we can. But first, I want to read one passage from your book, Policing Black Lives, where you say, "What would it look like to disinvest the incredible amounts of public funds that are currently diverted towards police and prisons and invest instead in community-run, community-based institutions that serve people's very real need for security, education, and dignity?" So these words are very topical with what's going on right now and represent well what you just presented. And currently in Montreal, there are popular conversations calling for the defunding of police departments. And just last week, the City of Montreal released a consultation survey that anyone can fill, which includes the option to reduce police budgets for 2021. And one of our questions that we got in was, is there a country or a city that's been successful in defunding the police? And at the same time, is body cameras a way to improve accountability, even though it does mean that it would lead to an increased amount of spending for police budgets?
Sure, I think that's a great question. So we're seeing really I think the opposite of police defunding at this time in Canadian cities, despite massive popular support, despite historic protests, levels of support for police defunding. We're seeing increased funding, for example, for policing in Toronto, in the province of Ontario more broadly. We're seeing Justin Trudeau had forwarded the notion of equipping all police with body cams, which again, just to highlight, is something that if we think about, if we ask ourselves the question, is this reducing police budget? The answer is no. Is this reducing police power? The answer is no. So for body cams specifically, there have now been a significant amount of studies on body cams in the United States where they'd been adopted more extensively than in Canada that cannot show or prove that body cams have actually reduced police violence. So in some instances, of course, the recordings end up promoting some level of, I guess, what you could consider accountability, but it's not actually preventing or ending violence or the killings of Black community members. So it's important to, in a context where there's such a massive support for defunding and to actually address policing at the heart of the crisis, which is to say that we should actually be taking police away from communities, not equipping them with better cameras to be policing our communities. I think we just need to understand, especially at this time, this push for body cameras is something that really is embedded with expanding the legitimacy of policing, especially in a context where, as we know, the Bureau d'enquête indépendante in Quebec, the SIU in Ontario, the police oversight in this country is a sham, right? So adding cameras to a system of total police impunity where police continue to kill Black and Indigenous community members like Chantel Moore, like DeAndre Campbell, like Regis Kaczynski-Paquet, only in the last few months, that throwing money at cameras at this time is not addressing the crisis that is bringing people out in historic numbers into the streets.
Thank you. Another question we have kind of relates to this term that we've been seeing a little bit on social media called propaganda, where it's the idea that in our media, a lot of time, police is presented as the savior and an institution that keeps us safe and the hero that comes in at the last minute. And this question asks, how can we teach the elementary and high school students early on the issues of defunding police, race education, and similar issues?
So I think that's a great question, because our children are taught in schools that the police are those who they can turn to for safety. It's very much a part of any television that you would watch, for example. Like, we are socialized to believe that police is safety. Of course, in Black communities, we know that we have to teach our kids differently, right? That we need to teach our kids that there are many contexts in which you should fear the police, we are teaching our kids how to de-escalate situations because we need them to recognize the possible harm. And this is something that Black communities have been making clear. So just to say that, there's different we's, of course, that for our communities, we have this sort of there's this double consciousness where we're raised to think of the police as those that protect us, but we are also, our parents and our loved ones and our friends and family intervene to also make it very clear to us that we are being targeted by those same people, those same people that are threatening our community members, that are taking people away from their families, so that we kind of live in this double situation. So I'd say that for Black communities, what we're seeing right now in this broader awareness across Canadian society is a way of taking away the stress of the burden of what some see as safety, we know to be violence. Right? So I think that that's something that's really powerful. And where our communities have been self-educating, and I mean Black communities specifically, what I think we need to see more broadly in one prong. I would never say that just changing curriculum is the solution to policing violence, but the fact that students in Canadian schools, in Montreal and Quebec and Ontario schools, are not learning about the legacy of slavery, are not learning about the afterlife of slavery, and its institutions are not learning about endemic police violence and criminalization in schools, means that people are being taught an inaccurate understanding of our society. And if you have an inaccurate understanding of your society, you're not able to participate meaningfully in working for change, right? So it's important that, of course, many Canadians might wish that this is not a reality, that Black communities were not being so disproportionate, were not being carted and stopped and arrested and beaten and killed. But this is the reality of life in Canada, and it's important that young people who are growing up have access to that understanding, as opposed to being taught falsehoods about what Canadian society actually is at this time. So I think that curriculum interventions are really necessary. That making the kind of materials and research accessible for young people is something that is really crucial. And also, again, taking seriously the concerns that we know that young Black people have continued to raise about about feeling insecure, about feeling unsafe at the hands of police, as opposed to gaslighting them out of that reality, right? There's just a way of actually having a curriculum that validates that knowledge.
Thank you. Another question we got relates to alternatives to policing. So you've mentioned this briefly, the idea of having community-based initiatives. However, in a lot of popular conversations about alternatives to policing have involved social workers, which you've briefly mentioned, are also an institution that works in a way that surveils and polices Black lives. So the question would be, how should the discipline of social work be restructured so that it does not become the new police?
Well, I think that's a really good question. I think that that's a long question, so I'm not gonna give an answer that I think would take me about 30 minutes to articulate about, what is the deep harms of the history of the practice of social work for so many of our communities. Besides highlighting, I think, the importance of the fact that we recognize and that we never uncritically advocate to replace the policing of law enforcement with other historically, carceral and presently carceral institutions uncritically. Right? So to not only say that, social workers should be in tandem with police for mental health calls, for example, when we know the legacy of social work in this country. We know, of course, even the way that mental health, we often talk, say that we need to replace calls, people who respond to police calls with trained mental health workers. But of course, if we understand and take really seriously the legacy of anti-Blackness and forced psychiatrization of Black communities, that we need to understand that it's crucial that we don't just expand the carceral web and policing and surveillance of our communities with other people who are deputized or delegated with the power of policing. So what that tells us is that it's really important for us to think, we're in a time of radical transformation where we're actually allowing ourselves, I think, to really dream more broadly about what it would need to really make a society based in safety. So I think there's no better time for us to tie this call to dismantle police and build safety differently, to really questioning the role of the way that social work has historically existed, and to radically transform that institution in such a way that it would not have the kind of power over, particularly of poor Black mothers, of poor Indigenous mothers, that we're not inadvertently expanding that kind of violence, which is itself a kind of policing, which is itself a kind of harm.
Thank you. Yeah,
I think I might have missed the first part of the question, but I hope that answers.
I think that answers it pretty well. And it kind of goes into the next question we have, calling for this radical change that is necessary to kind of ensure that Black people and Black lives are protected in our society and in our public safety institutions and security institutions. New people are coming into this idea of abolition and what that would look like. And somebody asked, what would it look like to hold cops that are who have been proven to have killed someone, so killing cops, accountable without turning to the criminal justice system and propagating the carceral system itself?
I think that's a great question, one that we all need to reckon with and think about constantly. And what we need to understand is that the criminal justice system was just not built in such a way as to be able to hold police accountable, which is why we've seen things like the SIU, like the Bureau d'Enquête Indépendante, do really precisely what the criminal justice system was designed to do, which is protect institutional violence while leaving our communities unprotected. So I think it's important that we recognize that it's a mistake to turn to the source of harm against our communities as the place that would somehow also rescue us from this same harm. And that's what is so powerful about the move to actually defund to police, to reduce the scope, reduce the harm, as opposed to focusing on this idea that we need to put killer cops in jail. It's about actually making it impossible for the police to kill us, right? By disarming police, by reducing the context that we have with police, that our communities, that police have over our communities, that's so much more likely to actually prevent those killings in the first place. I think the lack of indictments that we've seen since the creation of these so-called oversight bodies has made it incredibly clear that continuing to rely and pour money and activism and resources into those institutions really is a losing battle. And we're far more likely to see transformative shifts in actually moving away from the carceral response, in moving away from thinking about jail and policing as solutions to what's called crime, and actually addressing violence at the root, which of course at this time means also really imagining a police-free future, thinking about abolition of policing itself, because it's that could actually, make situations like the execution of George Floyd, of Pierre Coriolan, and so many others impossible, as opposed to, the idea that perhaps some of the officers that killed some of our community members would go to jail, because that's not justice. Keeping our people alive is justice.